Right. Okay, so welcome finally to my second P Lead Network meeting. I've got some guests with us today that I'm really grateful sort of that they've jumped on board. Hopefully, you won't have to listen to me speak for too long. No doubt you've come to listen to our guests, so we'll get into it. Try again. Certainly going to cut a little bit out. Right, okay, back again. Becky, can you see my screen? Right, super. Okay, I'm going to get straight into it now. If there's any more kind of disasters, I'll do my best to just blast through it. For anybody who's kind of not met me yet, I'm Niall O'Brien. I'm the education lead at North Yorkshire Sport. In terms of a bit of background, I've sort of been in around primary physical education for 15 years, and bolted onto that a huge passion for outdoor learning and physical activity more broadly in the primary school setting. I was heavily involved in the Creating Active Schools professional development tool, which I'm still involved in with my work at North Yorkshire Sport. I think we currently have around 9 schools that are part of our portfolio of schools that we're supporting. You'll be pleased to know, for those who've come on to learn a little bit more about a deep dive in physical education, I have a fairly strong track record. I'd like to think. Hope that doesn't come across as boastful, but I've worked in a number of schools over the years that I've been fortunate enough to get many inspections, and more recently was part of a fairly successful deep dive back in June 2022. I've supported the Department for Education in terms of the P and Sports Premium guidance through the summer, so I feel like I've got some at my children's school responsible for pupil premium and the P and Sports Premium funding. So just quick about trauma-aware pedagogies in PE, and then some of my colleagues from North Yorkshire, from the North Yorkshire Outdoor Learning Service, Teresa Thorpe, and I think Hazel's jumped on as well, so maybe she will say hello. We'll kind of wrap up things with my piece on an Ofsted deep dive and the new frequently asked questions document published by DFE recently. I'll share a little bit of information on that, and then we'll talk through some CPD opportunities. Okay, so if I can open my screen back up, and I was hoping to try and spotlight Tom, if I can do that, because I'd like Tom to jump on, because I know he's got to pick his children up shortly. So I'll make sure.
I'm here.
Let's have a look. Oh, you're here. That's grand. Right. So I just need to stop sharing my screen, and I'll let you do a proper introduction, Tom. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and see if I can share this presentation with you. Can you see those slides? Perfect. Excellent. So I can't see anyone because my 2 screens are going haywire. Niall, how long do you want me to save you a bit of time? Do you want me to? You tell me how long you want me to talk for, and I'll work to that.
I want you to talk for as long as you need. I know, as I say, Teresa's on the line. She might have to jump off as well, but I'm happy to dedicate the time that you two need, and I can shorten my section, no problem at all.
Okay, I'll do my best to run through it as quickly as I can for everyone. Yes. Hi everyone. My name is Tom Quarmby. You'll see my picture there. The more glamorous people on that list and the faces there are the brains behind the operation. So I'm just going to share with you our collective work around trauma-aware practice in physical education. So hopefully what you'll get from this is 4 things. You will understand what the problem is, so you'll get a deeper understanding of trauma, of adverse childhood experiences, and of toxic stress, and how it impacts on young people's development. You will be able to comprehend how trauma might manifest in certain situations. So if you're thinking of broad sport and physical activity context, or more specifically a PE lesson, what might it look like if a young person's been impacted by trauma and their behavior in that setting? Then I'll go through some trauma-aware pedagogies, some principles that underpin trauma-aware pedagogies that might be useful for supporting young people who've been impacted by trauma, but, and I'll reiterate this later, they're just reflective of good practice in general. So there's no reinvention of the wheel. It's just about elevating what we do for particular groups of young people. And then hopefully I will highlight a range of strategies that can be used to bring those principles to life. So it's all well and good me putting a sexy slide up that shows some principles, but we want to know what those look like in practice. So that's what we'll get to. There is a disclaimer. I will be talking about trauma and adversity, so it's a sensitive topic. So if anyone wants to shut down at any point, then please feel free to do so. So let's get straight into it. What we know is that trauma is recognised internationally as a significant issue. It impacts individual health, well-being, their broader life outcomes on a global scale. No social or cultural group is immune from the impact of trauma. All individuals, all communities might be impacted by it, but some groups might be more susceptible than others, and we'll touch on that as we move through. In essence, trauma is described as an experience that overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope with a particular situation. There are various types of trauma. So there are things like acute trauma, which results from a brief incident, so a car crash or an assault. Then there's chronic trauma, which results from more repeated and prolonged exposure. And then there's what we're going to focus on, which is complex childhood trauma. So repeated exposure to a range of different forms of adversity that are more often than not of an interpersonal nature. So these are what's known as adverse childhood experiences. So as I said, adverse childhood experiences tend to describe a range of stressful events that children and young people might be exposed to up to the age of 18. And the original study that was conducted in America identified 10 markers of adversity. So there's 3 that are related to abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. 2 that are related to neglect, physical and emotional neglect, and then there's 5 that are related to household dysfunction. So mental illness of, they're not my terms, apologies, mental illness of a sort of a sibling or a parent in that particular context, having a parent go to prison, if there is evidence of domestic violence, if there's substance abuse, and if there are increasing incidents of parental separation and therefore divorce. What we definitely know is that divorce is also more closely linked to substance abuse within the household and more closely related to potential forms of neglect. So in and of itself, that form of adversity might be related to other forms of adversity. And that's important for the next slide that I'll tell you about now. So in terms of the prevalence of these different forms of adversity in the UK, the last big study that tried to explore these, the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences in the UK was in 2014, and it looked at just under 4,000 adults aged between 18 to 69, asking them to reflect back on their prior experiences as a young person. And what we found was that there were 47% of those that were engaged in that study reported at least one form of adversity. So that might be abuse, it might be neglect, it might be various forms of household dysfunction. So that's quite a staggering number in and of itself. But then the study also found that just under 10% reported 4 or more forms of adversity. And that's hugely problematic when we consider that the more forms of adversity, the more exposure an individual has to ACEs, the more likely it is that they will not develop at the same pace as other individuals, that they will more likely have some form of learning difficulty or disability, that they will more likely end up working in county lines, that they will more likely be involved in drug and crime, and they will more likely die earlier than everybody else. If we look at recent figures, so recent figures from the NSPCC have reported that 1 in 20 children have been sexually abused, 1 in 14 have been physically abused, 1 in 15 have been emotionally abused, and 1 in 10 have been neglected. We also know that the COVID pandemic has increased the likelihood of young people experiencing different forms of adversity as a result of the fact that the lockdowns and school closures meant that many young people were forced to stay at home, and home might not necessarily have been the safe space that it is for other young people. So their safe space of going to school, a place of safety and security, was removed from them during that those lockdown periods. So we know from international studies, Save the Children, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, that there is likely to have been huge disruption due to the closure of education systems, that prolonged lockdown has negatively impacted on the mental health of young people, and that there is an increased prevalence of childhood abuse as a result of that. So I will quickly apologise because I realise I'm painting quite a bleak picture here, but I'm trying to set the scene for what's to follow. So those original 10 forms of adversity, those 10 markers of adversity, have frequently been criticised for being very household centric and not recognising that young people might encounter forms of adversity in the wider community. And so Smith identified additional adverse experiences that they also argued might have implications for an individual's health and well-being. And when you look at this, it's here where you can start to see what there are certain groups of young people who might be more susceptible to adversity than others. So experience in foster care has been identified as a form of adversity in and of itself. But if you're in foster care, you're more likely to be bullied, you're more likely to have low social capital, you are more likely to come from low social background, you are more likely to have poor academic performance. So there are certain groups of individuals who might face greater forms of adversity than others. What we know is that if an individual is exposed to an adverse experience, then it can result in stress. And this is the starting point for when we think about how it might become overwhelming for an individual and therefore be traumatic. So we know that some stress is good, right? Positive stress. So my son, for instance, going for a nasal, flu thingy, that's very stressful for him, but it's very short in duration and he gets over it with a bag of Haribo. So that's positive stress because it leads to increases in heart rate, mild elevations in the stress hormone levels, but they're able to recover from it very, very quickly, normally with support of a caring adult. There's also tolerable stress, which is very serious, but again, temporary in nature. And it might be that there is a death of a family member, which is a very stressful experience for a young person to go through, but it's mitigated by a positive supporting relationship of another family member. So again, those positive supporting relationships are helping those individuals to manage their stress and return to normal levels. The third form of stress is therefore toxic stress. So this is where there is an experience and the stress response system is activated and there aren't those protective relationships from a supportive parent or friend, PE teacher, whoever it might be. Those relationships aren't in place and therefore the stress system is continually being activated. So that's when it becomes toxic because the body isn't necessarily recovering in that particular instance. So you might find that if an individual is repeatedly being exposed to abuse, neglect, and parental substance abuse, they're in a heightened state of stress for a very long period of time. Remaining in that state can ultimately impact on the developing brain and body, as I'll go on to tell you, but importantly, it's an individual's response to those that determine whether or not they're considered traumatic. So everybody will deal with some form of adversity differently, depending on their individual makeup and the support systems that they've got in place. So I'm not suggesting that every single form of adversity is likely to be traumatic, but it could be. So what we know, and just to flag up, as you can see from my Google image, I'm absolutely not an expert in brain development, but I will do my best here to convey this to you. We know that the brain develops in a bottom-up sequence. So the primitive brain develops first, and that's vital for functions like your heartbeat, breathing, sensory, motor, and survival skills. Then the midbrain and the limbic system develop after that, which are responsible for things like attachment, emotion, memory, and arousal. And then the higher parts of the brain, the cortex right at the front, develop last, and they're responsible for the sophisticated functions such as thinking, language, learning, etc. We also know that complete brain development is not thought to occur until around the age of 25. So an individual's brain is continuing to develop up until that point, which means it's up until 25 likely susceptible to any changes in the body. Now, if an individual does experience an event that overwhelms them, so trauma, and they are in that heightened state of stress, then what happens is the brain shuts down all non-essential systems and the fear response, the primitive brain, takes over. So fight or flight mode kicks in. Now, when the stress response is triggered, when you're in a state of toxic stress, what happens is the body releases cortisol over a prolonged period of time. And if it's continually done over a prolonged period of time, then cortisol can actually alter the developing brain and the structures of the brain to the point where it might reduce the weight of the brain, the DNA content. It might delay the auditory, visual, and somatosensory potentials of the developing brain. It might have an impact on the hippocampus, which is particularly important for memory storage and retrieval. So ultimately, if an individual has experienced adversity to the point where they are in a state of toxic stress, it is overwhelming them and their body is releasing cortisol, there is a chance that it is having an impact on their developing brain. What we also know is if an individual is experiencing adversity to the point where it's overwhelming them, their brain is shutting down. And so the only thing that's going to kick in is their survival response. So what that means is an individual who might be in a state of trauma and experiencing toxic stress, they're likely to have a very narrow window of tolerance. That's their ideal operating window where they are able to self-soothe, to emotionally regulate, to connect with others, to control their emotions. Because it's a narrow window, it means that anything that is likely to trigger them will send them one of two ways. They will either become dysregulated to the point of hyperarousal, really distraught, panicked, hypervigilant, rapid breathing, or they will become hypoaroused to the point where they start to withdraw and shut down, look tired, depressed, fatigued, and aren't able to process information properly. Again, importantly, either of those two states will interfere with their ability to regulate emotions, to concentrate, to process information, and to store knowledge. So if, for instance, you're working with a young person who may have experienced trauma and adversity in the past, and they've gone through an event in a sports hall that has triggered them, it could be as simple as loud noises, and they suddenly jump into one of these two states, there's no point you trying to reason with them because it just won't go through, right? They won't be able to connect with you. They won't be able to process the information. From a physical development perspective as well, what we do know from the limited research that's out there is that any individual who's experienced a particular form of adversity, so we're talking about forms of abuse in very early childhood, it can have an impact on an individual's motor development. So if we're thinking about physical literacy in a PE context, for instance, then individuals who have experienced trauma and adversity may not be as physically developed as their peers who haven't experienced any forms of adversity. So we know that infants and toddlers might experience or express poor muscle tone, delays in fine and gross motor development and coordination, fail to develop and perfect basic motor skills, right the way through to primary age children who might show more generalized physical development delays, may lack necessary skills and sort of coordination for particular activities that require certain levels of perceptual motor coordination. So ultimately, anyone that's experienced adversity may have challenges in terms of processing information, learning, memory, memory retrieval, storage of information, might have a very narrow window of tolerance, which means they can be flicked outside of that window very easily, and may experience delays in sensory processing and motor skills as well. So you might say, okay, well, why does that matter? So it matters for physical education because unlike any other subject, it is the one setting within a school context that foregrounds the body, that foregrounds physical touch and contact, and where individuals are being asked to perform in front of others. And rightly so, that's the nature of physical education. But it means that because of those things, that might be a more triggering environment for individuals than, say, sitting at a desk and learning maths, because of the physical contact, because of the interaction, the competition element, etc. We know that physical activity and sport through physical education is beneficial for trauma affected young people because it helps with their physical development, but also their psychological and overall sense of well-being. So there are certain things like yoga and dance that are really good for mind-body practices that might help individuals in terms of developing their nervous systems, developing their ability to respond to stress. Equally, things like team games might be beneficial for individuals because it might help them develop positive relationships between peers and adults, which again might be a trigger for some. And things like skill building and goal-directed pursuits. So there's a range of evidence that suggests physical education and physical activity specifically could be really beneficial for young people. If we think about what it might look like in a PE context, then you might see things like a small foul in a game situation that escalates into a full-blown brawl. You might see young people refusing to be part of a team, not connecting with their teammates, struggling to adhere to the rules, and the key one, having an inability to handle any pressure situations. And what we know is that these behaviors can often be misinterpreted as just misbehavior. They're just being naughty in a particular context, whereas in reality, this is their individual way of coping with a particular situation. So whilst we might look at them and say, well, they're deviant, they're off task or whatever it might be, if we adopt a trauma-aware lens to view that behavior, we might have a better understanding that there's something that has triggered that, and it's not necessarily bad behavior, but it's their reaction to a particular situation that they simply can't deal with. So where have we got to? We know that there's a raft of literature out there on trauma-informed practice. Most of that literature hasn't been created in the context of physical education. So having worked with colleagues in Australia and with young people over a prolonged period of time, many of whom were care experienced and therefore likely to have been impacted by some form of adversity, we've co-created with them a set of principles. So this is my sexy diagram that I mentioned at the beginning. It took me ages to create. I don't know why. But we've got 5 principles which we think, or young people have told us, are beneficial for them if they've been impacted by any form of adversity. We're not suggesting that there's a hierarchy to these. Again, I'm not suggesting that you should reinvent the wheel. These are things that people do on a daily basis anyway. So it's just a case of elevating what those might be when working with particular young people. Importantly, the 4 pink boxes behind the principles are whole school approach to trauma. So there's a recognition that it's great if in a PE context we're trauma aware, but if that doesn't extend beyond that boundary, then they're just going from a safe space to a non-safe space in essence. So these 4 principles behind about realizing as a whole school or a whole setting, a whole community, whatever, realizing the impact of trauma, being able to recognize the signs of it, being able to respond appropriately, and then engaging in practices that resist re-traumatizing those young people. So what I'll do for the remaining 8 minutes is I will very quickly go through some of these principles, and then I'll give you some strategies that, again, have been co-constructed with pre-service teachers. So the first principle is around ensuring safety and well-being. So that's about physical and emotional safety. So if you're thinking, the classic example is in secondary schools and changing rooms. So the changing room for a young person who has been in care, and likely 65% of young people are in care because of abuse or neglect, that's a space where they're not likely wanting to get changed in front of other people. And so that's not a safe space. So what can we do to ensure that they feel safe, and that safety supports their sense of psychological safety and a sense of well-being? The second one is around facilitating and responding to youth voice. So listening to young people and responding to them in particular contexts, but also recognizing that children and young people are very diverse and complex, and bring with them a range of different experiences to that particular setting. I think the main thing for me here is the point about, if a young person knows that there is one adult there for them, then you are improving their chances of being able to process and respond to stress. Having a key individual in the life of an individual who's experienced adversity is absolutely vital. And I think, not putting more on PE teachers, because I know how much we do anyway, but it's a unique position because it's much more relational than it is other contexts and other settings. So you often find that when people think back about that one individual at school, it's likely the PE teacher that they're thinking about. The third principle is around establishing routines and structures. So any young person that's been impacted by adversity is likely to feel a sense of a loss of control. And so here it's a case of saying, and this isn't a go, throw out all the rules. This is a case of being very clear with children what rules they are expected to adhere to, so that they know what they are, that if there are likely to be changes, that they are forewarned of any of those changes, and that the structures that are in place, they're aware of them and they work to them. The fourth one is around developing positive relationships, because developing positive relationships helps build a sense of belonging. So that's a case of saying, well, what can we do for young people who've experienced adversity, to build relationships with their peers, to build relationships with adults? If a young person has been abused or neglected, or had a negative relationship with an adult in the past, it's really, really important that we create a strong foundation there. And then finally, the fifth one is around, what do you already do, and what else can we do to promote their strengths and self-belief? So anyone impacted by adversity is likely to have very low self-esteem, self-perception of themselves, self-competence. And so starting from a point of, you've turned up today, that's a fantastic achievement, might be the first step towards developing a relationship, for instance. So we need to recognize the skills, the value, the strengths that individuals bring to the particular context they're in, and help them recognize them too. Now, as I said, none of those are linear. I do think slightly more than others, if you can create a sense of safety and security, then it's probably easier to build some of the other foundations. But again, if you're able to promote strength and self-belief, it will help with developing relationships. So in terms of some strategies, so it's all well and good me showing you my sexy slide, but we need to be able to bring that to life. And so working with pre-service teachers, we identified a range of strategies that they thought could be used that would bring these principles to life in that sense. So I'm not going to talk through all of these, because I've got a PDF. I can send you the slides after, Niall, and you can share those, and you can burn them, do whatever you want with them. But some of the ones on there that are very simple things to do are allowing individuals safe spaces, timeouts, to be able to go and sort of have a space where they can try and self-regulate and then join back in when they're ready. Some principles back in education more broadly offer choice as a standalone principle. The young people we work with were very keen to point out that if you give us too much choice, it becomes overwhelming and we can't deal with it. But there might be a place for choice as a strategy to support them feeling safe and secure in that particular context. In terms of responding to youth voice, so things like active listening. I'm terrible at this with two young children. Not jumping in when they are talking to you, but allowing them to express themselves, share their thoughts and feelings before offering any comment. Having a traffic light system, or using emoji cards and things like that for young people who don't want to always verbalize their thoughts, but would quite happily give you a red card if it's not going the way they want, or if they're not necessarily understanding it. In terms of establishing routines and structures, things like being predictable, greeting individuals in the same way, whether that is through what you see on YouTube quite a lot, funky handshakes before people enter a particular setting. Great for establishing a routine, but also very good for building relationships and forewarning of any changes. So if you know something is going to change, don't spring it on young people at the very last minute, because that's likely to trigger them. Positive relationships, again, there's a range of different things there, and I have absolutely no doubt that everyone on this call would be able to add a ton of additional ones. I think the value of these principles are to use them as a reflective tool, and to say, if we're working with a young person who's been impacted by trauma, what do I already do that works towards developing positive relationships, and then what else perhaps could we do? So use them as a reflective tool in that sense. So we've got a range of different things there, strategies, checking in with individuals, sitting and talking to them on their level. There was a school in Scotland that had a no shouting policy, and that had a centrally agreed script, and it had restorative conversations to work with young people in that context if there were any behavioural outbursts. And finally, promoting strengths and a sense of sort of self-belief. Again, this is where our pre-service teachers struggle to come up with ideas, but I've no doubt others would be able to chip in. So if you know an individual can perform an action or a skill and is confident in doing it, supporting them to showcase that to others, if they're happy to do that, might be really beneficial for them. And again, setting small incremental challenges that allow them to build on what they're capable of doing. So again, nothing new, but it's beneficial for young people who've been impacted by trauma, as well as other young people in general. So finally, a couple of recommendations. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach. I think we need to not think about enacting all 5 of those principles all at once, but I think drawing on certain principles and certain strategies to support the children that you're working with within the context that you find yourself at a particular time. As I've said, I keep banging on about this, they're just reflective of good pedagogy. I think there's a lot of professional learning that can be afforded by looking at these principles. So workshopping with the people that you work with, what do we already do in this particular context, and elevating that. So this isn't at all a case of saying you're not doing X, Y, Z. This is a case of saying, what do you do in this space? That's brilliant, because it's really beneficial for these young people. Is there anything else we can do there as well? And finally, I think there's a need to recognize that this one session won't make you trauma informed. I'm not trauma informed. That's why I use the term trauma aware, because I think there's a journey that you need to go on, and I'm at the starting point of that journey. I also want to highlight that if you are working with trauma affected young people on a continual basis, then it carries a lot of baggage. And it can be emotionally draining for you as a teacher as well. And so I would advocate not just for self-care, because I'm not a fan of that, but for thinking about how you are being supported on a broader scale to work with those young people. If anyone wants any further information or wants to read any academic papers, I've figured out how to do QR codes, and they're all there for everyone. Happy to take questions at any point. If anyone wants to email me after, go crazy, and I will figure out how to stop sharing.
Thank you, Tom. Just checking you can hear me. People were saying that the signal dropped out a little bit, but yeah, I think you've saved the day there, and I knew you would anyway. Huge thank you. I'm sure colleagues will agree. Really, really fascinating stuff, and it certainly resonated with me when I think about the settings that I've kind of previously taught in, and the challenges with particular sort of high profile pupils. It certainly got me casting my mind back to certain scenarios, and things are starting to align a little bit. And as I progressed a little bit further on in my career, I think I was more conscious of it. But yeah, I think this will be particularly useful for lots of colleagues on the line now, and ones that will be hopefully watching the recording later. So a huge thank you from me. Thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, and I'll let you get off to collect the children from after school club. Super. Cheers, Tom. Okay, thank you everybody. I have seen in the chat that the signal's not been great. We will get Tom's presentation anyway, just for reference, and we'll see if we can get a recording again at a later date. I won't spend too long speaking. I want to get our next guests involved as soon as possible. So I think Teresa's going to speak on behalf of North Yorkshire Outdoor Learning Services. If Hazel wants to say hello as well at some point, that'd be great. If not, not a problem at all. Oh, hi Hazel. It's a great backdrop. That's cheered me up no end. Considering the tech issues, a little bit of nature has definitely made me smile. So I'll hand over to Teresa if that's okay, and I'll let you'll talk to us all about the benefits of outdoor learning.
Yeah, thanks, folks, and hello, everybody. I don't believe I'm going to save the day because I haven't got any sexy, slides. So I do apologise. Although I think Hazel's slide does make up for it, doesn't it? It's absolutely. She keeps joining meetings with me, and I can't focus on what we're supposed to be talking about. So, so let me introduce myself, and I'll introduce Hazel as well. So my name's Teresa Thorpe. I'm the head of the Outdoor Learning Service in North Yorkshire. Hazel's joining me as well. Hazel is the business manager for the Outdoor Learning Service. I've not met many of you before, if any of you, because I'm relatively new to the service. I only joined in September last year. It was quite a big move for me when I came up to North Yorkshire. So I'm not from North Yorkshire originally. You might tell by my rather posh accent. That's what people have told me. It's not posh, it's just a southern accent. But yeah, I was based down in Cambridgeshire, managing an outdoor learning facility for Cambridgeshire County Council. I've been involved in outdoor learning ever since I left school, hugely passionate about it, really keen to make sure we provide as many opportunities for young people as we can. I've become really concerned in the last couple of years following COVID about the closure of services, centres, etc. And then I came across the job advert for North Yorkshire, did a bit of digging into it and found that we have some amazing opportunities up here in North Yorkshire for young people. We've got two fabulous outdoor centres, Bewley Park and East Barnby, and then we've got an outdoor education advisory team as well. So it was a no-brainer for me, really, to come to a local authority where they've got a real commitment to creating high quality opportunities for young people. Plus, Cambridgeshire's great, but if you're a mountain biker and you're a climber, there's not many opportunities. So I'm really pleased to be up in the moors and the dales, and definitely really pleased to be working for the Outdoor Learning Service. So I'm going to spend, I have got some nice slides. I will get onto those in a moment. What I'm going to do is just talk to you. I'm not going to be promoting my service, although at the end I will kind of signpost you to where you can go if you want some further advice. I want to talk to you about the value of outdoor learning. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll just, if anybody's got any questions, then please put them in the chat. I'll also, in the chat, I'll provide my email details so people can drop me a line. So we haven't rehearsed this, have we? But what I'm hoping to do now, if technology is on my side, is share my screen. So let's see if this works, shall we? Careful not to show you my private emails. Thanks for laughing, Hazel. Right.
I laughed as well. I was just on mute just to make you feel better.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Can Hazel, can you tell me what you can see?
I can see your presentation, Teresa. All's good.
Can you just see the front slide or all the sides?
Yes, just the front slide.
Oh, that's perfect, folks, because I don't want to show you my notes. So I've already introduced myself. That's me, head of North Yorkshire Outdoor Learning Service. Next slide. So for me, this is a lovely diagram because I don't know how many people in the audience have got children. I've got children. I'm very lucky. I've got a 16-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. And this is what a typical day looks like for them. You know, I'm an advocate for sport and for outdoor learning, and I push my children as much as possible to be outside doing something positive. But if I'm honest with myself, this is what their day pretty much looks like. I refuse to, in fact, the nature segment of this diagram is when I force them to walk to school, folks. I won't drive them. So they have to walk to school. When they get to school, I would say most of their lessons, aside from PE, will be in a classroom environment. Then what do they do when they come home from school? Well, they don't really watch TV, my kids. They'll disappear upstairs and they'll be on technology. So a really small aspect of their day is outside and connected with nature. Which is really disappointing. Some recent research suggests that 8 to 11-year-olds were more likely to say they spend less time outdoors than those aged 12 to 15, who often say, I just don't want to go out. I prefer to spend free time indoors. And I don't know, did you come across the survey growing up in Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, which was done in 2018? There was a great piece of research there which said 94% of young people usually or always learn from experience, which concerns me. If such a small part of their day is spent outside, where are these young people learning about the nature and the world in which they live in? Just out of interest, how many people in the audience does that relate to, the young people you're teaching or the young people that you have at home? I think that's fairly typical. My teenagers aren't much different to many other people's teenagers. Now, for some young people, accessing nature is difficult. During COVID lockdown, only 1 in 3 people had access to outdoor space. And since COVID, 81% of children stated they've spent less time outside with friends. Sometimes it's the draw of technology. I think in the past we would have felt 2 hours on a phone is enough, but I wonder how many of us can cope with 2 hours on a phone now. We need much more. And sometimes the thing that prevents us from going outdoors is the worries we have, worries we might have as parents, as teachers, and as carers. So what are these worries about? I've got some interesting research and data here, folks. And I think it's quite understandable that parents are concerned about risks. You know, we wouldn't ever want to put the children that we look after in the school environment or our own children in a place of harm. But let's look at some data and just see how much of these perceived risks are actually real risks. So annual statistics since 1985, accidents involving young people, 700 road traffic accidents. There was 480 accidents in the home, that was through poisoning, suffocation, etc. And only 3 happened on a school trip. Given this data, we'd probably be a lot more cautious about putting young people in cars and transporting them to places. And funny enough, when I eventually get out the office and work with young people, perhaps we might be on high ropes or on a climbing crag. You know, young people are often scared, and my conversation with young people is around, well, actually, what you're just about to do is quite safe. And in my mind, I'm saying, well, actually, the riskiest part of your experience might be travelling here in a minibus or coming to the centre in coaches. But I don't go as far as to actually say that to the young people. I don't want to alarm them. A child at home is 500 times more likely to meet a stranger on the web than outside. The issue with all these concerns is that it has impacted on the freedom that we're prepared to give our children. So hopefully you can see that, folks. This for me is a fascinating diagram here, and just looks at how things have changed in the last 100 years in terms of where we will let young people go unaccompanied by adults. So 100 years ago, a young person could walk 6 miles to go fishing. 70 years ago, a young person could walk a mile. 40 years ago, a young person could walk half a mile. Now, we might let our young person go to the end of the road to meet their friends. Our concerns are largely based on irrational thoughts, but they are limiting our young people. The real risks, I believe, for young people are not being able to manage themselves safely outside. So the real risks for me for young people are they can't swim, they're not confident in open water. They can't ride their bike safely, and they can't manage themselves around traffic. The real benefits for me are teaching young people these skills. So my view, every year six young person should be able to swim, they should be able to walk to school, they should have adventures, and they should be confident to operate safely outside. And I think schools know this. We've seen the introduction of swimming lessons, we see bikeability in schools, and this is a really positive development for young people. So being in the outdoors, what does that do? There's been lots of research, but I think the challenge for us is often the value of outdoor learning. You can't quantify it. You know, we see it all the time. We're here at the centres, we see young people developing, you know, their self-esteem, their confidence, but actually putting a quantifiable figure on it is really difficult. But what do we see when young people are outdoors? We see them being happy. We see an improvement in their well-being. We see them develop some social skills. You know, if young people are challenged, they'll talk to colleagues, they'll talk to friends, they'll build relationships. And we all know a day out on the hill, we're going to sleep better that night, don't we? And it improves our physical fitness levels as well. Alongside that, I think we often overlook some of the academic performance as well. There has been some recent research to suggest that quality time outside can have a really positive impact on academic performance. So that could be reading, writing, maths. And we often think these subjects have to be taught in a classroom. You know, when we're outside, there is lots of amazing opportunities to talk about the weather, to talk about maths, to talk, you know, to see an item where you could, you know, where you could develop some creative writing around what's happening in nature. So it's not just around the development of oneself, it's about the development of academic performance as well. So here I've just got some statements around what are the impacts for young people when they spend time outside. We build up resilience, and for me that's a really important thing. You know, we've seen a big shift in how young people are arriving at our doors when they come on residentials. You know, we're finding young people are a lot more nervous about being away from home, a lot less independent, not quite as resilient. And I think those in schools will acknowledge they're seeing this shift in young people as well. And I think it's our duty to support young people in developing these skills. I will often say to teachers that the rate of change in terms of technology at the moment and life is amazing. We often, you know, young people that are at primary school now, we don't potentially know what jobs they'll be doing when they leave education because those jobs just haven't been created yet. So the best thing we can do as educators is make young people resilient, not make young people, support young people to become resilient, support them to be independent, support them to believe in themselves, you know, have a really positive growth mindset. And these skills and attributes are really easy to develop outside. You know, this young person here, I don't suspect they arrived at the Gill with that. Has she got a smile on her face? I think she has got a smile on her face, hasn't she? I don't think she'd arrived at the Gill and thought, right, I'm gonna do this. I've got this. I suspect she was probably quite nervous because it's not a normal thing to do, is it, to go and jump in a flowing river? But with some support, with wearing the right equipment, with encouragement from her friends, she's taken a big step and done something challenging, and she will be absolutely buzzing at the end of that session. And that development in self-confidence is something we really want them to take back to school, you know, and think about what steps they took to overcome that challenge, you know, and if a young person can transfer those skills back to school, that's just amazing, isn't it? That's the best we can hope for, really. Oh yes, and I absolutely get that doing outdoor learning with young people is not easy. You know, there's lots to do in terms of authorization to take young people outside. You know, you have to go on to Evolve if you're in that system and you know, ask for approval. You probably have to do some risk assessments. You probably have to book a minibus. You probably have to, you know, set up some payment system if there's a cost. So I do feel like I need to put this slide in to say, look, there's benefits for teachers as well. And for me, the key benefit is the relationships that you build with young people when you come on a residential, when you take them learning outside. I speak to so many teachers, and the consistent message I hear is, I never expected that from this child. You know, in the school, this child is quiet, perhaps doesn't have much confidence, and they would just see, you know, staff will see a completely different side of a young person, and it doesn't end when the experience stops. You know, that's an ongoing partnership and relationship that will support that child through their education. So what have we got down here? So professional development, health and well-being for adults as well as young people. Yeah, positive experience on teaching practice. Yeah, and improve relationships with their child. So what is outdoor learning? It doesn't have to be as adventurous as those pictures there, although they are pretty fantastic. It really is just about taking young people outside, creating some opportunities for young people to connect with nature. And it doesn't always have to be really structured, you know, allowing time in some woods for young people has such an amazing impact on them. You know, you will see them go from being quite nervous about the surroundings to moving further away from you, exploring the natural environment, perhaps climbing some trees, perhaps looking at some bugs. They will start to learn things about the natural world, and they'll start to learn things about themselves. But it really is just an opportunity to discover and experiment. And I guess the other thing I would add here is your natural environment is absolutely amazing, folks. So, you know, North Yorkshire is fantastic, and I think most schools will have access to some beautiful places to explore. So I'm very aware, you know, if you wanted to access a service like mine, there's obviously a commitment there in terms of costs. And I absolutely realise that, you know, money within schools is challenging, money within families is challenging. I would always argue that it's money well spent and there's a huge value. But I do want to, I guess, challenge some school leaders and say there is some stuff that can be done on the school grounds for very little or no cost. So, you know, for example, teachers could become forest, school and beach school leaders. So there's a process of qualification and training there for schools, which means you could take your schools into some, your young people into some forests and do some regular learning in that environment, or you could take them onto a beach and do some learning in that environment, which is really positive. But equally, if you didn't want to progress through that sort of qualification system, you know, schools could be setting up some orienteering courses on site. You know, young people could be taken outside of the school environment for local walks, for bike rides. Equally, the school grounds could be used for some initiative activities and some problem solving, but also camping in school grounds. You know, an ideal for me is that a school has a outdoor learning curriculum that starts when the young person first arrives, and is progressive, and there is something for every year group, you know, which may result in a residential and doing some really adventurous activities when they're in year 5 and 6. But certainly there's a starting point, and that starting point can happen within a school environment. I mean, wouldn't it be great to get some kids camping in your school grounds as their first overnight experience? And then I just wanted to mention about the John Muir Award. That's an environmental award that's very much set up for centres to kind of opt into. It's a lovely scheme. If you've never heard of it before, it's definitely worth Googling, but it's a lovely scheme that young people can work through in terms of their environmental understanding and learning. And they create a little project that they take ownership for over a number of weeks or months. And then there's, you know, I guess the change in terms of young people feeling confident outside will come through parents as well. So what might you do as school leaders, school teachers, in terms of supporting parents to spend quality time outside with young people? I find it quite disheartening when we get some year 5 and year 6 students at our services that perhaps can't do some of the basic skills that, you know, for example, riding a bike, you know, walk confidently outside. To me, you know, that's my aspiration really. Every young person should be able to swim, ride a bike, and you know, make the right choices around clothing being outside. And then you've just got a lovely little picture there from a school that just decided on a lovely spring day, it looks like, that no one was going to be inside. It was going to be outside. That might be a challenge in North Yorkshire, mightn't it? In Cambridgeshire, it's much easier. I'm just looking out the window and it's just started to rain. So, but pick the right time of the year. That would be an amazing thing to do, wouldn't it? And then just, I said I wouldn't plug the service too much, and I won't. But there is, you know, my desire is to have as many opportunities as possible for young people in North Yorkshire. And great if you come and utilise our service, but if you want to get the ball rolling at school and start with something fairly manageable, then we're really happy to support that. And we've got lots of tools we can use and we could share with you. Just remember, I've got the outdoor education advisory team in my service as well, so they're very familiar with coming out to schools and signposting you to creative activities you can do on the school grounds. That's all done through the outdoor learning cards which are listed there. And then if you do want to develop a more robust programme, then we've got some national governing body awards for teachers, which we have you know, on throughout the year, and you can access those through our service there, which, you know, first aid in the outdoors, forest and beach school, and then the lowland leader is a qualification where if you want to take your young people up onto well, not quite up onto the top, but, you know, outside the school grounds, doing some walking. Yes, so I think the next slide is questions. I don't know if anybody's got any questions or whether you just want me to stop talking.
Just in case anyone does put a question in the chat, just to kind of feedback there, it's again, won't surprise you, something very close to my heart in terms of developing outdoor learning in schools. And while we obviously would love every child to go on an external visit, it can be achieved in school. You know, you're absolutely right in terms of low cost, no cost ideas. I mean, you guys are the experts. In terms of my background, I'm sure I can support as well if you need something more sort of tailored towards your school setting, because as we know, even though we're in North Yorkshire, not every single school has got a plethora of green space within walking distance. So, you know, we also have some toolkits that might support as well in terms of developing outdoor learning opportunities in schools. So we can certainly support there. Yeah, so that's one thing I think I missed, to be honest, Teresa, being in school as a forest school practitioner, sort of a day and a half a week, which I realised was a luxury, but you know, some really memorable experiences created for the children, and that's what we want to achieve, don't we? It's sometimes that some children don't necessarily enjoy traditional sport. It might be more informal play. It might be connecting with nature, and we need to make sure that we're providing, you know, an array of opportunities to make sure our children are being active throughout the school day and beyond.
And the real value about the forest schools is it's not necessarily, you know, really tightly structured. It's about being outdoors and, you know, finding an activity that suits you, and there's an element of freedom which just young people really benefit from. So yes.
Super. Thank you very much for sharing that. And again, if anybody wants to directly get in touch with the team, I'll get the information across to you along with the presentation. I feel like I might magpie a couple of those images, if that's all right, Teresa. There's some really nice bits and pieces in there. It's great.
Yeah.
Super. Thank you. Right, I'll take you off spotlight to give you a break if I can figure out how to do it. There we go. Right, I'll get straight into it, guys. In the interest of time, there's some people on the call that hopefully will be interested to hear about sort of the PE deep dive support that we'll be offering today. So I'll share my screen and we'll get into it. Please stick anything in the chat if I've not covered it, and I'm happy to pick up individual conversations not directly after this session in the future. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Let's have a look. Let's just skip along a little bit. Here we go. I'm just checking in. Can somebody turn their mic on and let me know that you can see my Ofsted deep dive slide deck? Anybody at all? Before I get
can see it.
Super. Cheers, Richard, as well. Saw the hand go up. Right, okay. Super. So here's a whistle-stop tour of how I think I might be able to provide some support if anybody's preparing for a deep dive in physical education. Just pop this down a second and hopefully, here we go. Good stuff. Looks familiar. So here's the education inspection framework. And what I'd do is I'd encourage you as subject leaders to sort of have a glance at those different sort of sub-themes. And I guess the question is, do we have another subject in the curriculum that can sort of hit all those outcomes? When I think of the sub-themes, quality of education, behaviour and attitudes, personal development, leadership and management, it's probably me kind of being a little bit biased towards a subject, but I can't think of another subject in the curriculum that can support those outcomes better than physical education. So this is the programme of study for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 in terms of National Curriculum PE, and not to kind of read through it, but I've highlighted sort of key language in red, and I guess I want you to sort of think about if you were to be inspected and you are taking part in a deep dive, would you be confident to sort of look at this vocabulary and think, is my PE curriculum sort of achieving these outcomes? So just to kind of steal a few out of this section, are your pupils physically confident? Does your curriculum allow children to build character? Do we look at values and respect in terms of how we're operating our PE curriculum and how children are treating each other? Does our PE curriculum allow our children to have active and healthy lives? Are they engaged? Are we supporting them to develop their physical skill competence? It's just something to think about in terms of how your PE curriculum looks and how confident you would be to sort of articulate the outcomes of your own curriculum in school. So this is a piece of work produced by Hannah Miller, Ofsted's subject lead for PE sort of nationally. There was a subject research review fairly recently, and some of the language inside of the review I felt it'd be useful to share today. So we have here the 3 pillars of competence. We have motor competence, rules, strategies and tactics, and healthy participation. And these are certainly things I'd expect you, I would encourage you to become more familiar with, because these are sort of areas that I believe, certainly in my lived experience, an inspector may ask you about. So when we talk about motor competence, are we giving our pupils enough opportunity to practice techniques, sequences and different movements? When we talk about strategies and tactics, are our children informed? Are they able to talk about basic level tactics and develop sort of their understanding of tactics and strategies as they move through the key stages? And then healthy participation, always an interesting one, and something I was guilty of back in my teaching days, of not really spending enough time sort of dedicated to developing children's knowledge around what it is to be a healthy participant. How do they prepare for activity and recover? Then we're talking about sort of that affective domain, behaviours for learning, motivation, and how we use physical activity to affect sort of our short and long-term relationship with physical activity and physical education. So again, I would encourage you to sort of do a little bit of reading in terms of developing knowledge. That will certainly be a theme of a discussion during a deep dive inspection. The 2 types of knowledge in particular, so declarative, the know what knowledge, and procedural, the know how. That was something that the inspector spoke to me about at length back in sort of, I think it was June 2022. So as we look through sort of those 3 pillars, 3 pillars of competence, we'll look at motor competence first. So an example of the declarative knowledge would be recalling successes and key movements in a particular lesson. Are children able to sort of articulate that? And then procedural, the doing. Are they able to demonstrate skills with accuracy? Are they able to do it safely and efficiently? When we move on to rules, strategies and tactics, have children got the ability to recall successes in terms of when they've introduced a particular strategy and it's worked and been useful in a particular scenario? And procedural, can we see children practically applying strategies in particular contexts across the curriculum? And finally, the healthy participation pillar. Are children able to recall information on what they've learned in relation to healthy participation? Can they confidently answer a question about their participation level and how it supports them to be healthy? And again, it seems quite basic, but are children demonstrating that they can take part in a lesson safely and effectively? I've just added in a top tip here in terms of a discussion point you might have with an inspector during a deep dive session. My sort of example would be, often it's our less physically competent pupils that are better at articulating their knowledge. And I would sort of put this forward to an inspector because, you know, if we're being honest, not every single child is physically competent. You know, you have a handful of your more dominant sort of performers within physical education, but that's not to say that knowledge is not being developed in different ways. And often it's our less confident, our less physically capable children that are able to sort of share their understanding, whether that be assessment for learning opportunities such as observations, reviewing video footage, or providing peer-to-peer feedback. I've produced a really specific example here, and I was sort of mindful of whether I should put this into the slide deck or not. But I remember, and I've spoken to colleagues since who've also been involved in a deep dive. The inspector will potentially ask the question, how does complexity build over time across your curriculum? And I felt that was quite a challenging question at the time. And having spent some time speaking with the inspector, I also wasn't completely convinced that their subject knowledge on physical education was at the level I might have expected. So I was thinking, how do I use an example that I'm confident to sort of share, but one in which the inspector would understand in terms of how complexity increases and builds over time throughout each key stage. So we talk about selecting a novice, for example, somebody who's not yet developed the skills to be an expert learner, for example. So I used invasion games, and I talked about how in small-sided games we'd use overloads in favor of attackers. So when I talk about overloads, it'll be 4 attackers versus 1 defender. So in year 1 and 2, for example, to provide the attacking team, or the passing team, if you like, with lots of opportunities for success, there'd be 4 passing opportunities against 1 player that was trying to steal the ball, for example. And we'd show progression through the key stages. So as we arrive in year 3 and 4, this might be a very similar lesson, but it's progressed in terms of the personnel. So we might develop this then into 4 attackers versus 2 defenders in whatever type of context, whether it be related to sort of football, basketball, it might be related to a hockey type skill activity. And then, you know, quite obviously, as we move through into upper key stage 2, it could be that we have a 5v3 scenario. So all the time we're developing scenarios and situations to stretch and challenge to a certain degree, but not to the point where pupils are not getting as much success. And to sort of flip that, the inspector then talked about our more expert learners, you know, our really competent children. How do we stretch and challenge those particular children? So again, I flipped that particular scenario and we looked at the use of underloads. So when I talk about underloads, it might mean that we have, for example, 2 attackers versus 3 defenders. So you could reverse that again and perhaps have 3 attackers versus 2 defenders. And oh, excuse me, it skipped on a little bit there. So yeah, what was I saying? To stretch and challenge our more competent learners, it might be a case of, you know, using that underload where we represent 2 attacking players versus 3 defenders, you know, to really kind of push them along and get them thinking about decision making and applying more technical tactics. So another area that will probably come up during a meeting with an inspector would be information around memory and retrieval, and do your pupils get enough opportunity to go back and revisit and re-encounter skills that they've been previously taught? So as an example, it might be that you teach 6 weeks of invasion games, focusing through, let's say, netball in year 1. And then children might not revisit similar skills until year 6 or not at all. So the question is, how are we developing opportunities for children to apply the skills they've previously been taught later in the academic year? And an example that I shared with an inspector was the use of knowledge organisers. Now, I know this is quite a big debate in terms of some schools prefer to use them, some don't. Some knowledge organisers use for both teaching staff and children and support staff if they're involved in that particular scenario. And I must say that the inspector was particularly keen on talking through knowledge organisers and how this supported children to sort of go back and revisit the knowledge, whether that be declarative or procedural types of knowledge in previous years. And this allows you to kind of build year on year, sort of scaffolding those skills. It might be that you taught hockey-based skills in year 1 and looking at sort of attack versus defense in 3v1 situations, but that same skill and those same tactics and strategies can be applied in year 5, for example, in a basketball-led skill lesson. So it's about sort of tying in and building on prior learning, which was something that the inspector was particularly interested in. Moving on to early years, a real discussion point, not to skip ahead and talk about the PE and Sports Premium, but often because the PE and Sports Premium funding is calculated based on pupils from year 1 to year 6, occasionally schools don't feel they have to use that funding to invest in teacher training or resources for children in the early years. That's absolutely not true. Make sure you are considering investing in resources and developing teacher competence in the early years, because we want to make sure that our children are developing those very basic building blocks of stability, object control and locomotion, also known as fundamental movement skills. So be prepared for a conversation around how we are developing our children in terms of that physical development strand in the early years. In terms of SEND, this won't surprise you, and another fairly strong discussion point. I've got a question here. Do teachers and support staff have access to high quality, age and stage appropriate resources and equipment? That kind of ties in with the previous point made about how you are utilising your PE and Sports Premium funding. However, you may have all the most wonderful kit and equipment in school, but do you have the knowledge and understanding to deliver PE lessons in a safe and inclusive way? So we've got here an example of sort of a pedagogical approach, which is called the inclusion spectrum. Forgive me if some of you have already come across this, but I've found it a really useful tool in the past. It is designed to support disability sport in context, but can absolutely be applied to national curriculum. And I've hopefully got a few short video examples to kind of share. So the spectrum is made up of open activities where everybody can access and play within a particular activity. You've also got a modified activity, which is changed specifically to include everybody. You have a separate and alternative activity, and that might be for somebody who's having difficulty or somebody who's particularly competent, who needs that extra stretch, and a parallel activity where you can devise and structure your lesson based on ability groups in a particular scenario. Let's see if the videos work. We'll have a look. So here's an example of Key Stage 1. This is an open activity where everybody can play and they're all doing the same activity with minimal, if any, adaptations at all. And by the very nature, they're inclusive, so it suits every single participant. This might be an introductory task in your lesson, a warm-up, for example. I hope that that's playing. If the videos are not playing very well, I'll make sure I get these sent over as an example. Let's see if I can skip along. Here we've got an example of a modified activity. So this is changed to include. Everyone plays the same game or performs the activity, but the rules, equipment or area are adapted to promote inclusion regardless of ability levels. So we've got 3 examples here of sort of racket sports, sending and receiving. We've introduced barriers to support the children. Sorry, must be on a timer. We introduced barriers to support the children playing along the table at height, barriers along the floor for children that needed that little bit of extra support in terms of controlling the ball in that particular context. And obviously music always helps. Here we've got a parallel activity, so we can see the pupils here are taking part following the common theme of the lesson objective, but they do it at their own pace, at their own level, by working in a group that's of similar ability, but still getting lots of success and hopefully lots of enjoyment. And then this is the alternative separate activity. This particular example is a boy who was in year 5 who needed to be stretched and challenged a little bit. He was finding the task probably not as challenging as he might have needed to keep him occupied in the lesson. I'll let you read between the lines there. So his teacher actually came into this particular lesson and decided to play sort of a 1v1 game of ground level squash. So this can be dipped in and out of depending on how successful children are being, how much success children are having during their group work. So just an opportunity to dip out and be stretched and challenged a little bit further. If we can skip on. So I've kind of, on this slide, I've kind of put together 3 sort of sub themes, and this will certainly be something that's brought up, I would imagine. So we'll look at culture, systems, and assessment. Assessment, you know, it's a bit of a grey area, particularly in physical education, and we could have a whole session dedicated to this, I'm sure. And we can certainly look at that at some point if the network would like some more support on assessment. But in terms of culture, how is PE represented across your school in the wider curriculum? So we've just talked about outdoor learning in Forest School. What enrichment opportunities, clubs, school games offers, playtime provision? How do these kind of add on or add value to your PE curriculum? I would absolutely celebrate anything physically active that aligns with your PE curriculum, you know, to kind of celebrate all the great work around physical activity and well-being in your school. And then we look at systems. How do you monitor the quality of PE teaching and learning? Naturally, some people in school don't have the confidence and competence in physical education. You know, in an ideal world, I'd love us to change that, and all teachers have access to high quality CPD. But you know, schools are a busy place, and that will certainly take time. Are you able to confidently highlight any issues in PE, any requirements of teachers, any support, any training that's been requested to provide improvements? That will be certainly something an inspector would be interested in talking about, just that open and honest conversation about how you're developing the workforce in terms of delivering high quality physical education. And then we move on to assessment. Does your assessment system allow pupils to demonstrate their knowledge? Sort of historically, PE assessment is all about the kind of the procedural knowledge or the doing, the physical skills. But I would encourage you to look at your assessment framework, your assessment tool, and really start to consider how children are challenged around developing their declarative knowledge, because that was something that the inspector was impressed by, particularly in terms of, you know, supporting those children. They're not as physically competent, so really considering inclusion within PE and how we're supporting pupils to develop knowledge, whether that's the doing or the saying element of physical education. So I would encourage you to absolutely share your curriculum documents with the inspector. So your long-term plan, your medium-term plan. Are you confident enough to articulate the design of your curriculum? Is it skills-based? Is it sport-specific and led by sports across the academic year? Are you able to articulate your justification for that? And the rationale and design for your curriculum? If you speak confidently and you rationalize why you've decided to design your curriculum in a specific way, I think it's difficult to challenge. Every school context is very different. The pupils' needs are different. The staff's capability is different. So just be ready to really hit home and justify your curriculum design. I've mentioned about knowledge organisers already. I've got some examples if anybody is ever interested, and the sort of mixed year group examples. So we've got year 1, 2 knowledge organisers for invasion games. We've got year 3 knowledge organisers for sort of striking games. We've got a whole kind of range of knowledge organisers which you might be interested in looking at. That's obviously an option. Please don't feel obliged to for me to send those over to you. That's just an option if you'd be interested. And then moving on to the PE and Sports Premium funding document. This is not inspected by Ofsted. However, I would absolutely use it to demonstrate your subject leadership strengths. I'd have that printed out. The inspector will no doubt look at it if it's on your website, but it's not something that's inspected. So it's not something that I would be worried about. However, it is definitely a really strong tool to sort of showcase the work you're doing around PE, school sport and physical activity. And just to add to that, there are key indicators associated with the PE and Sports Premium funding, and the DfE have quite strategically reshuffled the order of the key indicators, and now we can see that professional development is key indicator 1. So that would be an expectation. I would suggest that, you know, if an inspector did decide to ask about professional development, you know, it's something that's certainly being considered in terms of your PE and Sports Premium spend. And at the bottom there, I've said celebrate your subject, celebrate. Really share your passion and enthusiasm for physical education. Sorry, my youngest son's just arrived. I want to quickly say hello. Let's go downstairs. Thanks, Carl. And yeah, just moving on. After my little visitor, the frequently asked questions section of the PE and Sports Premium has just been published in January. I've got a link there that I can send out to you all if you've got any questions or you want to take a look at it. Examples of what to find in the FAQs. I've kind of picked out some examples here that the network have asked about before. What is capital spending? Lots of schools are not sure what they can spend the money on in terms of capital spend. What is meant by external coaches who are engaged in repeated annual initiatives? That essentially means schools that are paying coaches to deliver the PE curriculum. There's lots of guidance around that, and that'll help you address any concerns there. Do Ofsted inspect the PE and Sports Premium? We've already talked about that. They won't inspect it, so to speak. However, it may be brought up in conversation, so do celebrate that document. How does the DfE monitor the PE and Sports Premium? There's lots of guidance in the FAQs about that, and I would strongly encourage you to have a read. And can we spend the PE and Sports Premium on water safety? The PE and Sports Premium can be spent on additional top-up swimming, not core curriculum swimming. That should be coming out of your school budget. And who is checking that the school is publishing their swimming and water safety data? Lots of schools decide not to publish their swimming data, but that is an expectation of the funding agreement. So please make sure that your swimming data is added to that document when you publish it on your website. Getting close to the end now, guys. Thank you for listening. Here are some of our CPD opportunities and resources at North Yorkshire Sport. The level 4, 5 and 6 PE courses available through the Leadership and Skills Foundation are very much in the pipeline. There's been a bit of a transition with Leadership and Skills, formerly Sports Leaders, so that's taken a little bit longer than we anticipated in terms of North Yorkshire Sport offering those courses. Live as we speak is their Active Start training for early years educators, and there's specific training coming up in Selby and Scarborough in April on the 11th and 12th respectively. So if you have any colleagues in your early years settings that are eager to access some training in physical development, I would absolutely encourage you to go and take a look. And then here we have the Whole School Physical Activity Conference. It's an international conference celebrating whole school approaches to physical activity, PE and school sport. And that is on Monday the 17th through to Wednesday the 19th of June. I'm not going to spend a long time talking through that at the moment, because that's a fairly lengthy piece of work, which would probably take me a good while to explain. But if you've got any interest whatsoever in attending the physical activity conference, or you want to know what's about, there is a barcode to scan there, or you can contact me directly for more information, and I'll be able to share that with you. Just below, I've added another link, a Twitter link, if anybody's using social media and you want to have a look at the Whole School Physical Activity Conference and what's kind of floating around on those social media channels. Please make sure you click that link below, and feel free to take a look. And that is pretty much it from me. If you have any kind of questions, I'm very conscious that was a quick whistle-stop tour of the support around Ofsted inspections, particularly PE deep dives. I have a number of resources which might be useful to you guys, and if there's anything you need and you've got an inspection coming up, I'm more than happy for you to get in touch with me directly, and yeah, I'll provide any support that you might need within reason, apart from turning up on the day. So yeah, that's it. That's just slightly gone over there by 4 minutes, and I do apologise. I'll make sure that my internet and the technology is much better the next time around. So thank you, everybody. Please be sure to drop me an email. I will send the slides out from our guests and the deep dive information from myself, and do get in touch should you need any support. Thank you for your time this evening. I know you're all very busy.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah.